The sound still echoes in my mind, that hollow clatter of ceramic against metal, the lid of the trash bin snapping shut like a judgment. I had spent 2 hours preparing that dinner. Herb-crusted chicken, roasted vegetables cut just so, the kind of meal that fills a house with warmth and the promise of family gathered around a table. Instead, I watched my daughter-in-law lift the plate with theatrical disgust, her nose wrinkled as if the food had personally offended her. "This is way too salty," she announced to the room, though she hadn't taken more than a single bite. "And honestly, who uses this much rosemary? It's like eating a garden." The others laughed. My son chuckled from his spot on the couch, not even looking up from his phone. Their teenage daughter snorted, rolling her eyes in that particular way young people perfect, as if the very existence of older generations is an inconvenience they must endure. Even their youngest, barely 8, giggled along, not understanding the cruelty but sensing the permission to join in. I sat at the kitchen table, my own plate untouched, watching this small theater of humiliation unfold. The chicken was perfectly seasoned. I had been cooking for 63 years, had fed 3 children through their growing years, and had hosted countless dinners where guests asked for recipes and second helpings. But in that moment, watching my carefully prepared meal disappear into the garbage, I felt something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding new ground. "Every insult leaves crumbs behind," I whispered to myself, so quietly that no one heard. But I heard. And in that hearing, something crystallized, not anger, not hurt, but a clarity so sharp it could cut glass. The laughter continued around me, casual and cutting, as if my effort meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. My daughter-in-law wiped her hands on a dish towel with exaggerated relief, as though she had just disposed of something toxic. The sound of that towel snapping against the counter joined the symphony of small cruelties that had been building in this house for months. I looked around the kitchen, in my house, with my dishes and my carefully tended herb garden visible through the window, and felt the last thread of accommodation snap. Not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. 10 days later, everything had changed. The locks on my doors were different now, their brass surfaces unmarked by familiar keys. In my bedroom, a manila folder sat on the dresser, thick with documents that proved what had always been true but somehow forgotten: this house was mine. The deed bore my name and my late husband's name, but never theirs. The mortgage had been paid in full for 7 years. They were gone now. My son and his family moved into a rental across town with 30 days' notice and a security deposit I had helped them scrape together because even in setting boundaries, I remained a mother. The house felt different without their constant noise, not empty, but spacious. Like a held breath finally released. I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where my dinner had been mocked and discarded, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the fragile peace of walking on eggshells, but the solid peace of knowing exactly where you stand and why you have every right to stand there. Peace is not begged for. It is built, I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. And I had built it, brick by careful brick, with bank visits and locksmith appointments and the kind of quiet determination that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't begin with eviction notices and changed locks. It began much earlier, with smaller surrenders and the gradual erosion of respect that happens so slowly you don't notice until you're standing in quicksand. The cracks had been forming for months, hairline fractures in the foundation of what I had believed was family harmony. It started when they moved in last spring, after my son lost his job and their apartment lease expired in the same devastating week. Just temporarily, he had promised, his eyes avoiding mine in that way that suggested he knew temporary might stretch longer than either of us wanted. I had said yes, of course. What mother wouldn't? My house had 4 bedrooms and only 1 occupant. I had space, and they had need, and the mathematics of love seemed simple enough. But mathematics, I learned, rarely accounts for the human variables that complicate every equation. The first month was honeymoon sweet. They helped with groceries, my daughter-in-law cooked dinner twice a week, and my granddaughter actually looked up from her phone long enough to ask about my garden. I began to think that maybe this arrangement would work, that maybe having family close would fill some of the quiet corners that had echoed too loudly since my husband's death 3 years earlier. But honeymoons end, and when they do, people settle into their true shapes. The grocery help became sporadic, then stopped entirely. The cooking contributions dwindled to takeout containers left on counters for me to clean. My granddaughter's interest in the garden lasted exactly as long as it took her to realize that plants require daily attention, not just Instagram-worthy photos. More troubling were the small assumptions that crept in like weeds. My son began answering my phone, screening my calls as if I were incapable of managing my own communications. My daughter-in-law rearranged my kitchen cabinets for better efficiency, moving items I had organized to my satisfaction for decades. They installed a new television in my living room without asking, then acted hurt when I suggested they might have consulted me first. "We're just trying to help" became their standard response to any gentle pushback. "We thought you'd appreciate the improvements." But the improvements felt like erasures, small ways of making my space conform to their preferences while maintaining the fiction that they were doing me favors. When I mentioned that I preferred my coffee mugs in the cabinet near the coffee maker, not across the kitchen near the dishwasher, my daughter-in-law sighed with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "This way is more logical," she said, as if logic were a country where only she held citizenship. The bills were another slow-building storm. At first, they contributed what they could, $50 here, $100 there, always with apologies and promises that things would improve once my son found work. I understood. I had been young once and had struggled with money and pride and the terrible mathematics of making ends meet. But understanding became enabling, and enabling became expectation. The contributions grew smaller and less frequent while the utility bills grew larger. 4 people use more electricity than 1, more water, and more heat. The grocery bills doubled, then tripled, as my modest shopping list expanded to accommodate teenage appetites and brand preferences I had never considered necessary. When I gently suggested we might need to discuss a more formal arrangement for expenses, my son's face darkened with embarrassment that quickly curdled into defensiveness. "I'm looking for work every day," he said, as if I had accused him of laziness rather than simply acknowledging mathematical reality. "It's not like I'm sitting around doing nothing." "I know you're trying," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'm just saying we should plan for the reality of 4 people living here instead of 1. But planning, I discovered, was not something they wanted to do. Planning required acknowledging that their temporary stay was becoming permanent, that their financial contributions were becoming negligible, and that their presence in my home was shifting from grateful guests to entitled residents. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. They stopped asking permission and started assuming consent. My car became the car, available for their errands and appointments without consultation. My grocery budget became our grocery budget, stretched to cover preferences I couldn't afford and wouldn't have chosen. My quiet evening routines were interrupted by television shows I didn't enjoy, played at volumes that made conversation impossible. When I suggested we might establish some household guidelines, quiet hours, shared chores, communication about schedules, my daughter-in-law's response was swift and cutting. "We're not children," she said, her voice sharp with offense. "We don't need rules and regulations. We're family." But family, I was learning, could be the cruelest word in the English language when used as a weapon. Family meant I should accept without complaint. Family meant my preferences mattered less than their comfort. Family meant gratitude was expected from me, not from them, even though I was providing housing, utilities, and increasingly, financial support for 4 people on a fixed income designed for 1. The dinner incident was simply the moment when all these accumulated slights crystallized into something I could no longer ignore or excuse. But even before that plate hit the trash, I had been making lists in my mind, not of grievances, but of truths I had been avoiding. Things I no longer owe, explanations for my own preferences in my own home. Apologies for asking reasonable questions about reasonable expectations. silence when disrespect masquerades as family dynamics. Gratitude for the privilege of being taken advantage of by people who share my blood. Things I no longer owe, my comfort for their convenience. My financial security is affected by their poor planning. My peace of mind for their emotional regulation. My space for their assumption that love means unlimited access without reciprocal respect. Things I no longer owe, the pretense that this arrangement was working. The fiction that temporary had any meaning in their vocabulary. The exhausting performance of being grateful for the chaos they had brought into my carefully ordered life. The list grew longer each day, written in my mind during the quiet hours before dawn when I sat with my coffee and watched the sun paint my garden in shades of possibility. Each item on that list was not rebellion but renewal, a reclaiming of truths I had temporarily misplaced in the name of family harmony. Not rebellion. Renewal, I whispered to myself one morning, watching the rain tap against my kitchen window like fingers drumming out a rhythm of change. The sound was gentle but insistent, the way truth often is when it finally decides to make itself heard. That morning, I made a decision that had been building like storm clouds for weeks. I would visit the bank. The marble counter felt cool and solid beneath my palms as I waited for the banker to review my accounts. I had dressed carefully for this appointment, my navy blue dress with the pearl buttons, the one that made me feel competent and serious. Not because I needed armor, but because I wanted to remind myself that I was a woman who had managed finances successfully for decades, who had raised 3 children and buried a husband, and navigated the complex mathematics of a life well lived. Mrs. Patterson, the banker said, looking up from his computer screen with the kind of professional smile that suggested he was about to deliver good news. Your accounts are all in excellent standing. What can I help you with today? I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind, but sitting there in the bank's hushed atmosphere, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of financial transactions, the words came more easily than I had expected. I need to open a new checking account, I said, my voice steady and clear. And I need to understand my options for removing authorized users from my existing accounts. The banker's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or the kind of professional discretion that comes from handling similar situations more often than people might expect. Of course, he said, pulling out a fresh folder and a pen. Let's start with a new account. Will this be for your personal use? Yes, I replied, and the word felt like a small victory. Personal use. My use. Not family use or household use or any of the other euphemisms that had gradually eroded the boundaries between my resources and their needs. As we worked through the paperwork, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the quiet satisfaction of making decisions based on my own needs and preferences. The banker explained options and interest rates, and I listened with the attention of someone who was investing in her own future rather than subsidizing someone else's present. Regarding the authorized users, he said, his voice carefully neutral, you have the right to remove anyone from your accounts at any time. Would you like me to explain the process? I nodded, and as he outlined the steps, simple, straightforward, entirely within my rights, I felt a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. My signature was not theirs to spend, I thought, remembering all the times I had discovered purchases I hadn't made, withdrawals I hadn't authorized, and decisions about my money made without my consultation. The process took less than an hour. A new account was opened, old authorizations were revoked, and fresh debit cards were ordered with my name alone embossed in neat letters across the plastic. I walked out of the bank with a folder of documents that felt like a declaration of independence, each page a reminder that financial autonomy was not something I had to earn or justify. It was something I had temporarily misplaced and now reclaimed. The afternoon sun felt warmer on my face as I walked to my car, and I realized I was smiling. Not the careful, diplomatic smile I had been wearing for months, but a genuine expression of relief and possibility. I had taken the first concrete step toward reclaiming my life, and it had been easier than I had imagined. That evening, I called a locksmith. The locksmith arrived the next morning with a van full of possibilities and a matter-of-fact attitude that I found deeply reassuring. He was a man in his 50s with calloused hands and the kind of straightforward manner that suggested he had seen every variety of human drama and learned not to ask unnecessary questions. "Standard deadbolt replacement?" he asked, examining my front door with professional interest. "Yes," I said, then paused. "Actually, I'd like to upgrade the security. Better locks, maybe a chain for the door." He nodded as if this were the most reasonable request in the world. "Smart thinking. You'd be surprised how many people wait until after they've had problems to improve their security." As he worked, I found myself watching his hands, competent, efficient, transforming my vulnerability into protection with each turn of his screwdriver. The old locks had been installed when my husband was alive, chosen together during a Saturday afternoon trip to the hardware store that now felt like a memory from someone else's life. These new locks were mine alone, chosen for my security, my peace of mind, and my right to control who entered my space and when. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, but it wasn't just symbolic, it was practical, necessary, and overdue. "You'll want to test these a few times," the locksmith said, handing me a set of keys that felt substantial in my palm. "Make sure you're comfortable with the mechanism before I leave." I turned the key in the new lock, heard the solid click of the deadbolt sliding into place, and felt something settle in my chest like a puzzle piece finding its proper position. The sound was definitive, secure, and final. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a sheet of my good stationery, cream-colored paper with my initials embossed at the top, a gift from my daughter years ago that I had been saving for special occasions. This, I decided, qualified as special. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation or negotiation. The evening light slanted through my kitchen window as I wrote, golden and soft, illuminating the careful formation of each word. "Dear Michael and Sarah, this letter serves as formal notice that your tenancy in my home will end 30 days from the date of this letter. I am requesting that you make arrangements to find alternative housing and vacate the premises by date. This decision is final and non-negotiable. I will be happy to provide a positive reference for your housing search and will assist with the security deposit for your new residence as I am able. Please let me know your moving timeline so we can coordinate the transition smoothly. With love and firm boundaries. Mom." I read the letter 3 times, checking for any hint of apology or justification that might have crept into the language. There was none. The tone was clear, kind, and absolutely resolute. I folded the letter into a matching envelope, wrote their names on the front in my careful script, and placed it on the kitchen counter where they would see it when they returned from whatever errand had taken them out for the afternoon. Then I made myself another cup of tea and sat in my living room, watching the light fade from the sky and feeling more at peace than I had in months. "A door closed is also a doorway kept," I murmured, thinking of the new locks and the letter and the bank account that belonged to me alone. The sound of their car in the driveway came just after 7 o'clock, followed by the familiar chaos of their return, car doors slamming, voices carrying across the yard, and the jangle of keys that would no longer work in my locks. I heard my son's confusion first, then his frustration as he tried the key again, his voice calling through the door. "Mom? The key isn't working. Are you home?" I walked to the front door, my steps measured and calm, and opened it to find my son standing on the porch with his family clustered behind him, their faces showing various degrees of confusion and irritation. "I had the locks changed," I said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. "There's a letter for you on the kitchen counter." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions, but I didn't fill it with explanations or apologies. I had learned that silence could be its own form of communication, and sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. My son found the letter first, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger as he read. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught breaking curfew, part guilt, part defiance, all wounded pride. "What is this?" he demanded, waving the letter like evidence of some great injustice. You're kicking us out? Your own family? His voice rose with each word, filling my kitchen with the kind of righteous indignation that people summon when they've been caught taking advantage of someone's kindness. Behind him, my daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed, her face set in the expression of someone who had been expecting this confrontation and had already decided to be offended by it. I'm asking you to find your own housing, I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. This was always meant to be temporary. Temporary? My son's laugh was sharp and bitter. You never gave us a timeline. You never said anything about this being temporary. I assumed, I said, the words coming out more quietly than I had intended, that you would want your own space. Your own independence. I assumed you were working toward that goal. We are working toward it, my daughter-in-law interjected, her voice tight with defensive anger. But things take time. Jobs don't just appear overnight. Apartments don't just fall from the sky. I looked at her, really looked, and saw something I had been trying not to see for months. She wasn't surprised by this conversation. She was angry about it, but not surprised. Which meant she had known this day would come, had perhaps been dreading it, but had chosen to hope it wouldn't arrive rather than prepare for its inevitability. How long did you think this arrangement would last? I asked, genuinely curious. What was your plan? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my son's face as he struggled to find an answer that didn't reveal the uncomfortable truth. They hadn't had a plan. They had been living day to day, month to month, in the comfortable assumption that my generosity was infinite and my patience inexhaustible. We thought, my son said finally, his voice smaller now, we thought you were happy to have us here. We thought you liked having family around. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed the depth of the misunderstanding that had been growing between us. They had interpreted my accommodation as happiness, my silence as contentment, and my increasing withdrawal as a natural adjustment to their presence. I do love having family around, I said carefully. But I also love having my own space, my own routines, and my own financial security. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, but they require balance. And we haven't found that balance. So you're just throwing us out? My daughter-in-law's voice cracked with emotion that sounded genuine, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tug of guilt that had kept me silent for so many months. But then I remembered the dinner in the trash, the casual cruelty of their laughter, and the way they had made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I remembered the bank account they had treated as their personal fund, the bills they had left for me to pay, and the assumptions they had made about my resources and my willingness to subsidize their choices indefinitely. I'm asking you to take responsibility for your own housing, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. The same way every other adult in the world takes responsibility for their housing. I'm not throwing you out, I'm giving you 30 days notice and offering to help with your security deposit. That's more consideration than most landlords provide. Landlords? My son's voice rose again, incredulous. You're our family, not our landlord. I'm both, I replied, and the truth of it settled around us like dust after an explosion. I'm your mother, and I love you. I'm also the owner of this house, and I have the right to decide who lives in it and under what circumstances. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, heavier, more final. I could see my son processing this new reality, the understanding that his mother and his housing provider were the same person, and that person had limits he had never bothered to identify or respect. Volume is not authority, I said quietly, looking directly at my son. Raising your voice doesn't change the facts. This house belongs to me. The deed is in my name. I've been supporting 4 people on an income designed for one, and that arrangement is no longer sustainable. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand, a gesture I had perfected during 30 years of teaching Sunday school, gentle but absolutely final. This conversation is over, I said. The letter explains everything you need to know. If you have questions about the logistics of moving, we can discuss those calmly and respectfully. But the decision itself is not up for debate. I turned and walked toward my bedroom, leaving them standing in the kitchen with their shock and anger and the dawning realization that their comfortable arrangement had just become a 30-day deadline. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs, the murmur of urgent whispers, and the sound of people trying to figure out how their world had just shifted beneath their feet. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to my heart beating, steady, strong, unrepentant. I had done what needed to be done and said what needed to be said, and the relief was so profound it made me dizzy. The next morning, I was in my garden when I heard my neighbor's voice calling over the fence that separated our yards. "Margaret? Are you all right, dear?" I looked up from the lilac bush I was pruning to see Eleanor's concerned face peering through the gap in the fence boards. Eleanor was 78, a widow like myself, with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from surviving 8 decades of life's surprises. "I'm fine," I called back, then paused. "Actually, I'm better than fine. Would you like some tea?" 20 minutes later, we were sitting on my back porch with steaming mugs and a plate of the honey wheat bread I had baked that morning, the first time in months I had baked for pleasure rather than obligation. The lilacs were just beginning to bloom, their purple clusters heavy with the promise of spring, and the air smelled like possibility. "I heard raised voices last night," Eleanor said carefully, her eyes on the garden rather than my face. "Not that I was listening, mind you, but sound carries." I smiled at her diplomatic phrasing. Eleanor had been my neighbor for 15 years, and we had developed the kind of friendship that thrived on mutual respect and carefully maintained boundaries. She would never pry, but she would always offer support if it was needed. "I asked my son and his family to find their own housing," I said simply. It was time. Eleanor nodded as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. "How long had they been staying with you?" 8 months, I replied, and hearing the number out loud made me realize how long I had been accommodating an arrangement that had stopped working after the first month. 8 months, Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. "That's well past the point where temporary becomes permanent, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, feeling a rush of gratitude for her matter-of-fact acceptance of my decision. I kept thinking things would improve, that we would find a rhythm that worked for everyone. But some rhythms are just discord pretending to be music. Eleanor laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, my dear, that's beautifully put. And how are you feeling about it all?" I considered the question seriously, taking a sip of tea while I examined my emotional landscape. "Relieved," I said finally. "Sad, but relieved. Guilty, but certain. It's complicated." "The best decisions usually are," Eleanor said. "Simple decisions don't require much courage. It's the complicated ones that show us who we really are." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lilacs sway in the morning breeze. The flowers were just beginning to open, their color soft and hopeful against the green backdrop of spring leaves. I thought about how lilacs bloomed for such a short time each year, how their beauty was precious partly because it was temporary. "You know," Eleanor said eventually, "I went through something similar with my daughter a few years after Harold died. Not the same circumstances, but the same feeling of being taken for granted by someone I loved." I looked at her with surprise. Eleanor rarely talked about her family difficulties, preferring to keep her private struggles private. "What did you do?" I asked. "I set boundaries," she said simply. Clear, firm, non-negotiable boundaries. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most necessary. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. Her words settled into my chest like seeds finding fertile ground. "Support can bloom quietly, lavender soft," I murmured, thinking of how her gentle affirmation felt more valuable than a dozen dramatic declarations of solidarity. "Exactly," Eleanor said, as if she had heard my thoughts. "The best support doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just shows up, steady and reliable, like good neighbors and spring flowers." We finished our tea in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes between people who understand that not every moment needs to be filled with words. When Eleanor left, she squeezed my hand and told me she was proud of me, and I believed her. That afternoon, I spent time organizing my documents, a task I had been putting off for months but now felt urgent and necessary. I pulled out the manila folder I had started at the bank and began adding to it: the deed to my house, my mortgage papers showing the loan had been satisfied, my insurance policies, my will, and my financial statements. Each document was a piece of evidence in the case for my own autonomy, proof that I was not a helpless elderly woman in need of management but a competent adult who had been temporarily confused about where her responsibilities ended and other people's began. I made copies of everything, organized them in clear plastic sleeves, and labeled each section with neat tabs. The process was methodical and soothing, like meditation with paperwork. Each page I filed was a small act of self-advocacy, a quiet declaration that I was taking charge of my own life. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the meals I would cook for myself: simple, satisfying dishes that reflected my preferences rather than accommodating 4 different sets of dietary requirements and complaints. I thought about the quiet evenings I would spend reading in my living room without the constant noise of television shows I didn't enjoy. I thought about the grocery bills that would return to reasonable proportions and the utility costs that would reflect one person's usage rather than 4. Steady steps, no drumbeat needed, I said aloud, thinking of how this reclamation of my life didn't require dramatic gestures or grand announcements. It just required consistency, clarity, and the quiet courage to prioritize my own well-being. The folder grew thick with documentation, each page a reminder that I had built a life of stability and security through decades of careful choices and hard work. I had earned the right to protect that stability, to make decisions based on my own needs rather than other people's expectations. As the sun set, I made myself a simple dinner: a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, comfort food that required no justification or accommodation. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the quiet sounds of my house settling around me like a contented sigh. Tomorrow, I will hand them the envelope. The next evening, they were all gathered around the kitchen table when I entered with the manila envelope in my hands. The scene was almost a mirror of the dinner incident that had started this whole process, except this time I was the one standing while they sat, the one with something to deliver while they waited to receive. The envelope was thick with copies of documents: the deed, the mortgage satisfaction letter, the bank statements showing my financial independence, the locksmith's receipt, and the formal eviction notice with all the legal language that made my request official and binding. I had spent the morning with a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had listened to my story with the kind of professional compassion that suggested she had heard similar tales many times before. She had reviewed my documents, confirmed my rights, and helped me understand exactly what I could and couldn't do as a homeowner dealing with family members who had overstayed their welcome. "You're being more than generous," the lawyer had told me. 30 days notice and assistance with security deposits? Most people in your situation would be far less accommodating. Now, standing in my kitchen with the envelope in my hands, I felt the weight of that generosity and the strength of my legal position. I wasn't being cruel or unreasonable. I was being clear. "This contains copies of all the documents you'll need to understand the situation," I said, placing the envelope on the table between us. "The deed to this house, the mortgage papers, the bank statements, and the formal notice I mentioned in my letter." My son reached for the envelope with the expression of someone who hoped the contents might somehow change the reality he was facing. As he pulled out the papers and began to read, I watched his face cycle through recognition, understanding, and finally, a kind of defeated acceptance. "You really own this house outright," he said, his voice flat with the realization that his assumptions had been built on sand. "I do," I replied simply. "Your father and I paid off the mortgage 7 years ago. This house is my asset, my security, and my responsibility. And my decision." My daughter-in-law was reading over his shoulder, her face growing paler with each page. "These bank statements," she said quietly, "they show that you've been supporting us completely for months." "They do," I agreed. "And they also show that my income is fixed and limited. I can't continue to support 4 people indefinitely. The silence that followed was different from the angry silence of the previous evening. This was the silence of people confronting facts they had been avoiding, numbers that didn't lie, and legal documents that couldn't be argued with or explained away. My roof. My rules. My peace, I said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute finality. This is not a negotiation. This is information. My granddaughter, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Where are we supposed to go? Her voice was small and scared, and I felt my heart clench with the familiar pain of loving someone whose choices you cannot control. But I had learned the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between helping and harming, and between temporary assistance and permanent dependence. Your parents will figure that out, I said gently. They're adults, and they're capable of making arrangements for their family. I have faith in their ability to solve this problem. It was a gift, that statement of faith, though I wasn't sure they recognized it as such. I was refusing to solve their problem for them, but I was also expressing confidence in their ability to solve it themselves. It was the kind of tough love that feels like abandonment to the person receiving it, but is actually a form of respect. My son folded the papers back into the envelope with careful precision, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he looked up at me, his eyes held a mixture of hurt and understanding that reminded me of the boy he had been, the one who had tested boundaries and learned consequences and eventually grown into a man I was proud of. We'll start looking for places tomorrow, he said quietly. And Mom? I'm sorry. About the dinner, about the money, about all of it. I didn't realize how much we were taking advantage. The apology hung in the air between us, genuine and painful and long overdue. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. This was what I had been waiting for, not groveling or dramatic promises, but a simple acknowledgement of the reality we had all been living. I know you didn't mean to, I said softly. But impact matters more than intention. And the impact was becoming unsustainable. We talked for another hour about practical matters, timelines and logistics, references and security deposits, and the mechanics of untangling lives that had become too entangled. The conversation was calm and productive, the kind of problem-solving discussion that should have happened months earlier but was happening now, finally, when it mattered most. When they went to bed that night, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea and felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, making decisions that aligned with my values, and living in harmony with my own needs and limitations. 3 weeks later, I watched from my front window as the moving truck pulled away from the curb, taking my son's family to their new apartment across town. The goodbye had been tearful but not bitter, complicated but not hostile. They understood now what I had been trying to tell them, and I understood that love sometimes requires the courage to disappoint people in the service of a larger truth. The house felt different immediately, not empty, but spacious. Like a held breath finally released, like a song that had been played in the wrong key, suddenly finding its proper pitch. I walked through the rooms, noting the absence of clutter, the return of my own rhythms, and the quiet that felt like peace rather than loneliness. In the kitchen, I put the kettle on for tea and pulled out the ingredients for bread, real bread, the kind that takes time and attention and fills the house with the smell of home. As I measured flour and salt, I thought about the dinner that had started this whole journey, the plate of food that had been dismissed and discarded with such casual cruelty. Tonight, I will cook for myself. I would set the table with my good dishes, light a candle, and eat slowly, savoring each bite without apology or explanation. I would taste my own cooking with the appreciation it deserved, and I would remember that feeding oneself well is an act of self-respect, not selfishness. The bread dough was soft and elastic beneath my hands as I kneaded it on the floured counter, the rhythm of the work soothing in a way that felt almost meditative. Outside my kitchen window, the late afternoon sun slanted through the lilac branches, casting dancing shadows on the wall. The house was quiet except for the gentle sounds of my own making, the whisper of dough against wood, the soft hiss of the kettle beginning to warm, and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I shaped the dough into a round loaf and placed it in the Dutch oven my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. The pot was well seasoned now, darkened by years of use, and it held heat like a promise. As I slid it into the oven, I felt the satisfaction that comes from creating something nourishing with your own hands, something that would fill your home with warmth and your body with sustenance. While the bread baked, I prepared the rest of my dinner, a simple salad from my garden, dressed with olive oil and the last of the herbs I had dried from last summer's harvest. I set my table with the good china, the set with the tiny blue flowers that I had been saving for special occasions. Tonight felt special enough. Tonight felt like a celebration of the ordinary miracle of being at peace in your own space. The bread emerged from the oven golden and crackling, its crust singing as it cooled, the sound bakers call the song of the bread, the music of gluten and steam finding their balance. I cut a thick slice while it was still warm, spread it with butter that melted immediately into the crumb, and took my first bite standing right there in the kitchen. "Peace tastes like honest bread," I murmured, and the words felt like a prayer of gratitude. I carried my plate to the table and sat down to eat in the golden light of early evening. The bread was perfect, crusty outside, tender within, with the complex flavor that only comes from time and patience and the kind of attention that cannot be rushed. The salad was crisp and bright, the green sweet from the cool spring weather. As I ate, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 weeks ago, I had been a woman who felt like a stranger in her own home, who had gradually surrendered her autonomy in the name of family harmony. Tonight, I was a woman who had reclaimed her space, her resources, and her right to live according to her own values and preferences. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been built through small, deliberate choices, a bank visit, a locksmith appointment, a carefully worded letter, and a conversation that refused to be derailed by guilt or manipulation. Each step had been simple in itself, but together they had created something powerful, the restoration of my own agency. I finished my dinner slowly, savoring not just the food but the silence, the space, and the freedom to eat at my own pace without accommodating anyone else's schedule or preferences. When I was done, I cleared my plate and washed my dishes, taking pleasure in the simple ritual of caring for my own things in my own way. The evening was warm enough to sit on the front porch, so I made myself another cup of tea and settled into the wicker chair that had been my husband's favorite spot for watching the neighborhood wind down from the day's activities. The lilacs were in full bloom now, their fragrance drifting across the yard like a benediction. Eleanor appeared at her fence, as if summoned by the peaceful evening, and waved when she saw me. "How are you settling in?" she called, and I knew she meant settling into my own life, my own space, and my own choices. "Beautifully," I called back and meant it completely. She smiled and disappeared into her house, leaving me alone with the gathering dusk and the sound of birds settling into their evening roosts. A car passed occasionally, neighbors returning from work or errands, but the street was mostly quiet, the kind of suburban peace that I had forgotten I loved. I thought about my son and his family, probably sitting down to their own dinner in their new apartment. The transition had been difficult for all of us, but especially for my granddaughter, who had struggled to understand why her grandmother would kick them out when they needed help. I had tried to explain it in terms she could understand, that sometimes helping people means teaching them to help themselves, that love includes boundaries, and that taking care of yourself isn't selfish when it allows you to be genuinely helpful rather than resentfully accommodating. I wasn't sure she understood yet, but I hoped that someday she would. I hoped that when she was older, she would remember this as a lesson in self-respect rather than selfishness, in the importance of maintaining your own foundation so you can offer genuine support rather than grudging sacrifice. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see it was from my daughter-in-law. We had exchanged only practical communications since they moved out, logistics about mail forwarding and forgotten items, but this message was different. "Thank you for the bread recipe you left in the kitchen. I made it tonight, and it turned out perfectly. The kids love it." I smiled, remembering the index card I had left on the counter during their final week, my grandmother's recipe for honey wheat bread, written in my careful script with notes about timing and technique. It had been a small gesture, a way of sharing something valuable without making a big production of it. I typed back, "I'm so glad it worked for you. Bread is forgiving if you're patient with it." The response came quickly, "I'm learning about patience. In a lot of ways." I stared at the message for a long moment, recognizing the subtext, the acknowledgement of lessons learned, and growth happening. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something perhaps more valuable, evidence that the difficult conversations we had shared were bearing fruit in the form of increased self-awareness and responsibility. "Take care of yourselves," I typed back. "I love you all. We love you too. And we're doing okay. Really okay." I set the phone aside and returned to my tea, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the liquid. This was what healthy boundaries looked like, not walls that kept people out, but clear lines that allowed genuine relationships to flourish without resentment or exploitation. The sky was deepening from blue to purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I thought about the woman I had been 8 months ago, when my son's family first moved in, eager to help, willing to accommodate, gradually losing herself in the process of trying to be everything to everyone. That woman had been kind but not wise, generous but not sustainable. She had confused enabling with loving and accommodation with support. She had been so afraid of seeming selfish that she had forgotten the difference between selfishness and self-care, between boundaries and barriers. The woman sitting on this porch tonight was different, not harder, but clearer. Not less loving, but more discerning about how that love was expressed. She had learned that you cannot pour from an empty cup, that you cannot give what you do not have, and that taking care of yourself is not the opposite of taking care of others but the foundation that makes genuine care possible. A gentle breeze stirred the lilacs, releasing another wave of their sweet fragrance. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling grateful for this moment, this peace, this hard-won clarity about what I owed to others and what I owed to myself. Tomorrow, I would call my other children, my daughter in California and my youngest son in Chicago, and tell them about the changes I had made. Not because I needed their approval or permission, but because I wanted them to understand that I was still the same loving mother I had always been, just one who had remembered how to love herself as well. I would also call the community college and ask about the pottery classes I had been thinking about for years, but never quite found time to take. With my house quiet and my schedule my own, I had time now for the kinds of pursuits that fed my soul rather than just filling my days. The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the dark sky like seeds of light. I finished my tea and stood to go inside, feeling the pleasant tiredness that comes from a day well lived, a problem well solved, and a life well reclaimed. In the kitchen, I set my cup in the sink and turned off the lights, leaving only the small lamp by the back door to welcome me home if I decided to take an evening walk. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of wood and stone adjusting to the cooling air. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, where the manila folder still sat on my dresser, not because I needed to refer to it anymore, but because it had become a symbol of my own competence, my own agency, and my own right to make decisions about my life based on my own needs and values. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the dinner that had started this whole journey, the plate of food thrown away with such casual disregard, the laughter that had cut deeper than any deliberate cruelty. At the time, it had felt like an ending, like the final proof that I had become invisible in my own home. But it hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, the moment when accumulated hurts crystallized into clarity, when accommodation transformed into action, when a woman who had temporarily forgotten her own worth remembered who she was and what she deserved. I pulled back the covers on my bed, in my room, in my house, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being exactly where you belong. The sheets were clean and smooth, the pillows arranged just the way I liked them, and the room was quiet except for the gentle sounds of a house at peace with itself. Before I turned out the light, I looked once more at the folder on my dresser, thinking about all the documents inside, proof of ownership, evidence of competence, records of a life built through decades of careful choices and hard work. But the most important document wasn't in that folder at all. It was written in my heart, in the language of self-respect and healthy boundaries and the quiet courage to prioritize my own well-being. It was the deed to my own life, and it had always belonged to me. I turned out the light and settled into sleep, surrounded by the peace I had built with my own hands, one small, brave decision at a time. Outside my window, the lilacs released their fragrance into the night air, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called once, then fell silent. In the morning, I would wake in my own space, make my own coffee, and begin another day of living according to my own values and preferences. I would tend my garden, bake my bread, and remember that taking care of yourself is not selfish, it is the foundation upon which all genuine generosity is built. The house was quiet now, but it was not empty. It was full of possibility, full of peace, and full of the kind of contentment that comes from knowing exactly who you are and having the courage to live accordingly. And if someone needed to learn that lesson, if someone found themselves in a similar situation of gradual erosion and accumulated disrespect, I hoped they would remember this story. I hoped they would understand that it is never too late to reclaim your own life, never too late to set boundaries, never too late to remember that love without respect is not love at all, it is just another form of taking. The bread would rise again tomorrow, golden and fragrant and made with my own hands for my own nourishment. The tea would steep in my own cup, sweetened to my own taste, and sipped at my own pace. The decisions would be mine to make, the consequences mine to bear, and the peace mine to protect and cherish. This was what freedom looked like, not dramatic or flashy, but quiet and steady and absolutely real. This was what it meant to come home to yourself after a long journey through the wilderness of other people's expectations. And it tasted exactly like honest bread, warm from the oven, shared with the person who mattered most, the woman who had found the courage to save herself.